Let's continue with our STAAR PowerPoint. This, of course, is Jarrett Chapter 10, and this is Part 2 of the series. And let us begin with it. All right, we're continuing with the rise of nativism as we finished in the last video. We were talking about the rise of nativism, a dislike, a distrust for foreigners. And we have a couple illustrations over here. On the right, at the top, we have a funnel. And over here, you can see the Europeans trying to get into the large part, the wide part of the funnel. And over here in America, Uncle Sam is limiting those that actually come through. And this is a political cartoon of the day showing our resistance to allow immigration to continue at the pace it had been, particularly those new immigrants. And we'll talk a little bit more about those in just a moment. Here at the bottom is an image we've seen previously. You have these wealthy men, these 5 wealthy men, here, there, and over there. There we go. And they are attempting to keep the recent immigrant, we can assume he's from Eastern or Southern Europe, trying to keep him from getting off the ship, getting off of the boat as he comes to America. And you can see the dock right here where they're standing. You can see the plank right there, the gangplank where he's walking down. In the background, we can see these images, which is what these rich men used to be. They themselves are descendants of immigrants. So again, it shows sort of a hypocrisy of the wealthy not wanting to allow new immigrants to come to America when they themselves were, or at least their relatives were at one time, a new immigrant. And of course here, a little bit more difficult to see, a picture of the Statue of Liberty, but instead of carrying a torch, she is carrying a stop sign. So those are some of the images of the time. Let us continue. After World War I, immigration was reduced. Immigration was reduced to a trickle. And again, you kind of go back to this concept over here with the funnel. As nativists pushed for Congress to restrict European immigration, they were wanting Congress to restrict it, in some cases do away with it completely. But nativists were pushing for Congress to restrict European immigration for really the first time in our history. The new immigrant, and these are people from Eastern and Southern Europe, the new immigrant who had really no skills or education or ability to speak English, these were seen as a threat to America's economic stability because it felt that they would come in and become a drain on the economy. These new immigrants settled in the cities. Again, these new immigrants, and we've discussed this previously, settled in the cities and added to the strain of providing public services. Now, again, as we have discussed, there had been a huge influx of settlers into the north, particularly the northern cities, the industrialized cities, New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, Chicago, so forth and so on. From about 1870 to about 1900, about 30 million people came to America. And around the beginning of, to the end of the First World War, we had hundreds of thousands to 1 million or so blacks moving northward from farms in the south, looking for jobs again in those same cities. And we discussed how industrialization and urbanization has created all kinds of problems in these large cities, pollution, crime, spread of disease, so forth and so on. And it was believed that after World War I, and again, this is the era we're looking at right now, after World War I, that these new immigrants would add to that cost, that strain upon public services by forcing cities to help these individuals, that these individuals would cause, create more confusion, chaos, crime, pollution, so forth and so on. Now, this is a little bit different than some of the issues we're having today and some of the discussions that are going on today with Syrian refugees or immigrants from countries that are thought to be compliant with or sympathetic of Islamic terrorism. That's a little bit different argument. You may hear some people say, well, it's about the same thing. It's not really. And we'll probably go into greater depth on that later on. But for right now, we're going to move on to the next slide. And we will continue with the rise of nativism. We had 3 laws passed in the 1920s. 3 immigration laws passed, 1921, 1924, and 1929. These 3 laws were designed to keep immigrants from Eastern and Southern Europe. And again, those were the new immigrants. It was designed to keep them out of America. Quotas were set allowing a certain number of immigrants from each country to enter the United States. A quota is a specific number. You have a quota of items produced at your job, or a quota of the number of sales you are to conduct. Let's say you are a car salesman. You have a quota per month of 5 cars. You must sell 5 cars per month. That's your quota, or you lose your job, whatever the case may be. Okay, let's continue. Great Britain, Ireland, and Germany were allowed the most. They were allowed the most immigrants, while the new immigrant was limited. Immigrants from Southern Europe and Eastern Europe were limited, and Asians and immigration from Asia, particularly Chinese, was stopped completely. So, these 3 laws in 21, 24, and 29 in total did all of these things right in here. Over here we have in this middle one, it's really the only one I'm going to take a look at or mention at this moment. We have a chart showing you some of the immigration, and we have the red represents the north. Again, we're talking about this one right here. The represents the immigration, the old immigrants from the north and the western part of Europe, England, France, Germany. And the blue represents the new immigrants, which would be the southern and eastern Europe. Europeans, and you can see the dates right there. And from 1881 to 1890, there was a huge number, well over 75% of the immigrants came to America were from those northern and western European countries. 1891 to 1900, we see a dramatic shift right there, and that shift continues to grow from 1901 to 1910. We start to see here, change that color right there, we start to see a shift back away from it, and it continues. 1931 to 1940, we are still looking at 30 or a little over 30% of our immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. But again, we've seen a huge shift, a huge change in immigration from right here to right there, and that is all due to these laws right there. All right, let's move on to our next slide. Eugenics. Now, we have discussed this previously in some depth, but I do want to make sure that we fully understand this. Eugenics is that right there. Eugenics, the theory was that the human race could be improved by breeding. This was a science, not really. Pseudoscience is what the term the book uses, but again, it really wasn't a science. But we'll get to that. During the 1920s, there was a belief in the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race, and the Anglo-Saxons would be those Western Europeans, okay? The Northern Europeans, the English, the French, the Germans even. Many, the third bullet right here, many held racist beliefs that light-skinned, blonde-haired, blue-eyed people were superior, kind of like Germans are Hitler's master race in Germany. And this is all based, of course, on this concept of racism. Social Darwinism, and we have discussed this several times, was the idea that different races competed for survival, just like plants and animals did. And the races we're talking about, the Caucasian, the black race, Asians, Native Americans, those types of people. We're not talking about Mexicans versus Puerto Ricans or British versus Ugandans. We're talking really about the races, not nationalities or ethnic backgrounds. People who believed in social Darwinism, the people who believed in social Darwinism explained that the rich were rich because they were superior intellectually, or they just adapted better than the non-rich. Okay. We have this eugenics certificate up here. Let me read it to you. And that is this, of course, right there. The eugenic certificate. This guarantees that I have examined the gender of this card and find a perfect physical and mental balance and unusually strong eugenic love possibilities, well fitted to promote the happiness and future welfare of the race. I assume that there's some kind of political cartoon and it's supposed to be making fun of eugenics. Here we have a prototypical Anglo-Saxon white Protestant WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant WASP, WASP couple getting married. And kind of strange, but again, we're looking at a strange period of time. Let's move on. We have finished that little section. We're going to move on to another little section. Our learning objective in this next little section of slides. What was the 1920s Republican presidential approach to laissez-faire government? The 1920s are dominated by the Republican Party in terms of the White House. Things we need to look for as we look at and think about and discuss laissez-faire government. Number one, laissez-faire attitude that limited government interference in business. Again, that's the whole idea. The business of business is business, as Calvin Coolidge said. And the more limited government was in business, the more successful it was thought that business would be. And that these three Republican presidents, and we'll take a look at pictures of them and look at each one individually in just a moment, they were all big supporters of big business. All right, let's move forward. And here's a picture of our three presidents, Republican presidents in the 1920s. Warren Harding, right there, Calvin Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover. Now, Warren G. Harding was elected in 1920, died while in office in 1923. Coolidge served out his term and then was elected to his own term in 1924. Chose not to run in 28, which he could have legally done. There was no law against it at that time. Chose not to. And then that takes us to 1928 when Herbert Hoover was elected. During the 1920s, three Republicans controlled the White House for 12 years. Again, keep in mind, Hoover was elected in 28. He served, he lost the election in 1932 to FDR and served until early 1933. So again, from 1921, when Warren Harding was inaugurated, to 1933, when FDR was inaugurated, those 12 years were controlled by the Republicans in the White House. They supported laissez-faire. They're all big supporters of laissez-faire, which of course is a policy of minimal government interference in business activities. Let's take a look at each of the presidents individually. Warren G. Harding, and there's a picture of President Harding right there. And of course, his campaign slogan was a return to normalcy. In 1920, Harding won the presidency in a landslide. His Democratic challenger was really not in a good position to win. Many people blamed the Democrats for the war. In fact, many people called it Mr. Wilson's War. Woodrow Wilson, the President of the United States at that time, so they called it Mr. Wilson's War. And so pretty much anyone who ran for the presidency as a Republican was going to win. And I would refer you back to the 2008 to 2008, the 2008 presidential election, when after 8 years of George W. Bush in office and the job the media did on him, pretty much any Democrat who ran would win, hence the Barack Obama presidency. We're not going to go into the failings of Barack Obama at this time. We'll do that later on. But to be perfectly honest, Barack Obama was really not prepared for the presidency. He really had no resume for it. And let's face it, Warren Harding is the same way. As you saw in the video I showed you a couple of days ago, about the only thing that Warren Harding had going for him is that he looked presidential. He really was not well-liked or well-respected within the Republican Party. But the 1920 convention for the Republicans was difficult. They couldn't choose a candidate, and so in a backroom deal, Harding was selected because he was thought to be the least offensive and thought to be probably the most easily controlled. Okay. Let's return to this. Bullet 2, President Harding captured the national spirit with his return to normalcy campaign slogan, and he won rather easily. Bullet number 3, Harding focused less on foreign policy. And again, keep in mind, we had just fought a world war, participated in a world war. We had over 3 million men in uniform. We had well over 300,000 casualties, costing us billions and billions of dollars at that time. And so people were not interested in continuing that type of policy. And so Harding focused less on foreign policy and more on peace and prosperity at home. Our third bullet, under Harding, the USA, United States of America, refused to join the League of Nations. Okay, and this little illustration over here shows the other countries of the world trying to kind of, pull us in, trying to get us involved with the League of Nations, and we, of course, were not going to let that happen. Instead of focusing in on and participating in some of these foreign events, these international events, Harding lowered taxes and restricted immigration. Two things that people wanted. People were making more and more money. They wanted to pay less in taxes, which means they get to keep more of their own money. And because of the Red Scare, people were becoming more and more distrustful, more and more wary, more and more afraid of immigrants and some of the political ideas and ideology they would bring with them. Now let's move on to our next slide. All right, let's go to Warren G. Harding. And I do not believe that Warren G. Harding was a criminal. I do not think he was a crook. Now, of course, with that happy statement in mind, I also have to say that I never really did a lot of research into President Harding as a human being. But I do know there was a lot of things that happened during his administration, a lot of scandals, which, again, I have never read anyone who said that they're his fault. What they do say is that he brought in people to his administration, his friends, referred to as the Ohio gang, who were criminals, who were crooks, but again, not Harding. Does that relieve him of the responsibility of these scandals? Well, it doesn't. Of course, he did die in office before these scandals really came to light. How he might have dealt with it, I have no idea. It doesn't really matter. He died in 1923. We're looking at over 80 years ago, so it's not like we can go back and say, well, you should have done this or that. I mean, we can, as we study history, we can do those kind of things. But again, I don't think he was a criminal. I think he was just somewhat misguided with his friends. Okay, the first bullet, Harding urged tolerance, and I think this is something that he is very rarely credited with. He was urged tolerances toward other races, and of course, other races being from the white race. He supported greater rights of African Americans and anti-lynching laws for African Americans, and primarily African Americans. And of course, he had a tolerance or supported tolerance of Jews. Jews have always been, and this is an Old Testament thing, thousands of years, the Jews, once they left Egypt, were scattered to the corners of the world. And Jews have always been somewhat picked on, disliked, distrusted. Anti-Semitism, the distrust of Jews, is widespread around the planet. And Harding came out and said, hey, we need to be tolerant toward other peoples. We need to do away with lynching laws. We need to be more tolerant of African Americans, more accepting of them into our society, and the same thing with Jews. Our second bullet, Harding appointed people who were his friends, referred to as the Ohio gang, to positions of power. A number of them were in the cabinet as either secretaries of whatever department, like Interior. Albert B. Fall was the Secretary of the Interior. He's the guy who got busted in the Teapot Dome scandal. But this takes us to this concept over here of the spoil system. We've talked about it in the past, not a lot lately. The spoil system was pretty much done away with thanks to the Progressive Era and the passage of any numbers of pieces of legislation at the federal and the state level. Essentially, the spoils system, just as a quick refresher, was a way in which I, as a candidate who wins, is able to reward the people who helped me get elected by giving them jobs, by ensuring that their companies get government contracts, those types of things. All right, the biggest scandal that was to come out of the Harding administration was the Teapot Dome scandal. It was one of the worst in history. One of Harding's cabinet members, Secretary of Interior, Albert B. Fall, leased government lands to friends, which is not a bad idea. This happens all the time. We lease land out to people, to companies, so they can drill for oil on it or cut trees down to build tables and chairs. But what was the bad part is that Albert B. Fall, took a bribe for it. That is what makes it illegal, that quid pro quo. Additional scandals involving some of Harding's appointees popped up again. This is all taking place pretty much after his death in 1923. Some of these other friends of his, this Ohio gang, were caught stealing money from America, from American agencies. Again, this is all happening after his death. Let's move onward. We only have 2 or 3 more slides in this little section, then we'll finish it. Calvin Coolidge, President Calvin Coolidge, he was the VP under Harding, and when Harding dies in 1923, Coolidge becomes president. That's just the way it is, and that, of course, is explained here in that first bullet. Coolidge was reelected in 1924. Again, the country was doing well. The country was prospering. We were staying out of European affairs pretty much, and everybody seemed pretty happy. And so the re-election slogan, or actually the election slogan, because he was not elected in 1920, but the election slogan was "Keep cool with Coolidge." Yeah, kind of catchy. The kind of stuff you see on bumper stickers and flyers and buttons, that kind of stuff. And here's an example of that right over here. Anyway, he won relatively handily, won pretty easily. Silent Cal, as he was nicknamed, because he was not much of a spokesman. He wasn't a gregarious. He wasn't an outgoing guy. Didn't make a lot of speeches. Silent Cal, as he was called, he had a motto which was, "The business of America is business." Again, we go back to this laissez-faire, and all 3 Republican presidents during this period of time believed in laissez-faire. And, of course, Silent Cal, his comment, "The business of America is business," resonated throughout the decade. Anything the government could do to help business, as long as businesses were employing people and not too many people were dying from their products, the government's pretty happy. Anyway, getting back to this, the U.S. economy boomed under Coolidge, and the laissez-faire attitude toward the economy led to over-speculation. We've talked about this a little bit, and we're talking more about it really in the next chapter. But this over-speculation resulted in the stock market crash. Now, it's just one factor. It's not the only one, but it's probably the most important. Let's move forward. Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was a long-time contributor to politics. Herbert Hoover, organized the U.S. food production in World War I. He worked for President Woodrow Wilson, Republican. Herbert Hoover worked for Democrat Woodrow Wilson during World War I, and he was in charge of organizing U.S. food production in the United States during World War I. He predicted, kind of silly, the end of poverty if he were elected president in 1928. Now, again, this is kind of stuff that we hear these days. President Obama, when he was running for office, or right after he got elected, he made the comment that, if I'm elected, or now that I'm president, the earth will heal itself, that global warming, which again is not fact, global warming will reverse in the world, the earth will heal itself, on and on and on and on. I mean, we hear this kind of stuff all the time through many presidential elections, through many presidential candidates. But this is kind of a silly one. The end of poverty. Now, again, hey, that's a noble cause. I'm on board with it, but it's kind of unrealistic. Hoover was impressed with the achievement of business and raising the standard of living in America. Okay, he felt that this would continue to go up and up and up. Hoover said that this rugged individualism, in one of our vocabulary terms, had happened because of these three things. Individuals were given equal opportunities. We kind of go back to Teddy Roosevelt's square deal concept. In addition, they had a free education, and they had a will to succeed. So Hoover believed that an educated population with the will to succeed and given the opportunity will be successful. You know what? I kind of agree. In fact, I do agree. I think many people would agree with that. The last bullet, Hoover felt that too much government, now again, here's the question, what's too much? I don't know. No one really does. That's the problem. Let's get back to this. Hoover felt too much government interference in business would ruin a good thing, The government involves itself too much in business. It would ruin the success that we were having in his attempt to end poverty. Okay. That ends our second video. That ends our, there we go, STAAR. And this is over the material found in Chapter 10. And of course, this is Part 2. That ends our video. We will continue with this next section with our next video. So with that, I am